The Holocaust began in January 1933 when Hitler came to power and technically ended on May 8, 1945 D-Day. Over 1.1 million children died during the Holocaust. Young children were particularly targeted by the Nazis to be murdered during the Holocaust. They pose a unique threat because if they live, they would grow up to parent a new generation of Jews. Many children suffocated in the crowded cattle cars on the way to the camps. Those who survived were immediately taken to the gas chambers. The most intensive Holocaust killing took place in September 1941 at the Bogulia ravine just outside of Kiev, Ukraine, where more than 33,000 Jews were killed in just 2 days. Jews were forced to undress and walk to the ravine's edge. When German troops shot them, they fell into the abyss. The Nazis then pushed the wall of the ravine over, burying the dead and the living. Police grabbed children and threw them into the ravine as well. In 1946, 2 partners in a leading pest control company, Tesh and Stabino Testa, were tried before a British military court on charges of genocide. It was argued that the accused must have realized that the massive supply of Zyklon B they provided to concentration camps was far above the quantity required for delising. They were convicted and hanged. Between 1933 and 1945, more than 11 million men, women, and children were murdered in the Holocaust. Approximately 6 million of these were Jews. Prisoners, mainly Jews, called Sonderkommando, were forced to bury corpses or burn them in ovens. Because the Nazis did not want eyewitnesses, most Sonderkommandos were regularly gassed and fewer than 20 of the several thousand survived. Some Sonderkommandos buried their testimony in jars before their deaths. Ironically, the Sonderkommandos were dependent on continued shipment of Jews to the concentration camps for staying alive. The final solution was constructed during the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. 14 high-ranking Nazis met in Wannsee, a suburb of Berlin, and presented a program to deport all Jews to Poland where the SS would kill them. Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, occurred throughout Germany and Austria on November 9, 1938, when the Nazis viciously attacked Jewish communities. The Nazis destroyed, looted, and burned over 1,000 synagogues and destroyed over 7,000 businesses. They also ruined Jewish hospitals, schools, cemeteries, and homes. When it was over, 96 Jews were dead and 30,000 arrested. In the initial stages of the destruction of European Jews, the Nazis forced Jews into ghettos and instigated a policy of planned, indirect annihilation by denying them the basic means of survival. In the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland, the largest ghetto, about 1% of the population died each month. An estimated 1/3 of all Jewish people alive at that time were murdered in the Holocaust. In his memoirs, Rudolf Hess described the process of tricking the Jews into entering the gas chambers. To avoid panic, they were told they had to dress to be washed and disinfected. The Nazi guards used a special detachment team of other Jewish prisoners to help keep an air of calm and to assist those who were reluctant to undress. Children often cried, but after members of the special detachment team comforted them, they entered the gas chambers, playing or joking with one another, often still carrying their toys. Over 1 million people were murdered at the Auschwitz complex, more than at any other place. The Auschwitz complex included 3 large camps: Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Monowitz. The word Holocaust is from the Greek holodol plus kaustos, burnt. It refers to an animal sacrifice in which the entire animal is burned. It is also known as the show, which is Hebrew for destruction. The terms show and final solution always refer to the Nazi extermination of the Jews, and the Holocaust refers to the overall genocide caused by the Nazis, while the general term Holocaust can refer to the mass killing of any group by any government. The term Holocaust became a household word in America when in 1978 NBC television aired a miniseries titled Holocaust. However, Holocaust survivor and author Elie Wiesel called the miniseries country and offensive. Wiesel objected to what he thought were historical inaccuracies, German and Jewish stereotypes, too much drama and not enough documentary. He also argued that television was an inappropriate medium to portray the Holocaust. Approximately 220,000, 500,000 Omanis Gypsies were killed during the Holocaust. Unlike other genocides in which victims are often able to escape death by converting to another religion, those of Jewish descent could be spared only if their grandparents had converted to Christianity before January 18, 1871, the founding of the German Empire. Of the 9 million Jews who lived in Europe before the Holocaust, an estimated two-thirds were murdered. Millions of others, including those who were disabled, political and religious opponents to Hitler, Romanis, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals, were also murdered. The majority of people who were deported to labor and death camps were transported in cattle wagons. These wagons did not have water, food, a toilet, or ventilation. Sometimes there were not enough cars for a major transport, so victims waited at a switching yard, often with standing room only, for several days. The longest transport of the war took 18 days. When the transport doors were opened, everyone was already dead. Those who survived Dr. Joseph Mengelé's experiments were almost always murdered and dissected. Many children were maimed or paralyzed and hundreds died. He was known by children as Uncle Mengele and would bring them candy and toys before personally killing them. He later died in a drowning accident in Brazil in 1979. Twins fascinated Nazi Dr. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. According to one witness, he sewed together a set of twins named Guido and Ina, who were about 4 years old, from the back in an attempt to create Siamese twins. Their parents were able to get some morphine and kill them to end their suffering. Hitler introduced the Nuremberg laws in 1935, which made it illegal for Germans to marry or have sex with Jews. It also deprived Jews of their German citizenship and most of their civil rights. The 1940 Nazi pseudo-documentary The Eternal Jew attempted to justify the extermination of Jews from Europe. The movie claimed that Jews were genetically destined to be wandering cultural parasites. On November 11, 1938, Germany enacted the regulations against Jews' possession of weapons, which made it illegal for Jews to carry firearms or other weapons. Gas in the chambers during the Holocaust entered the lower layers of air first and then rose slowly toward the ceiling, which forced victims to trample one another in an attempt to breathe. Stranger victims were often found on top of the pile of bodies. Muselmann, German for Muslim, was slang for concentration camp victims who gave up any hope of survival. They would squat with their legs tucked in an oriental fashion, with their shoulders curved and their head dropped and overcome by despair. Jewish writer and Holocaust survivor Primo Levi stated that if he could enclose all the evil of our time in one image, I would choose this image. Carbon monoxide was originally used in gas chambers. Later, the insecticide Zyklonbu was developed to kill inmates. Once the inmates were in the chamber, the doors were screwed shut and pellets of Zyklonbu were dropped into vents in the side of the walls, releasing toxic gas. SS Dr. Joan Kremer reported that victims would scream and fight for their lives. Victims were found half squatting in the standing room only chambers, with blood coming out their ears and foam out of their mouths. Hitler was able to build a network of over 1,000 concentration camps in several ways. First, he established a legal basis for acts of brutal inhumanity by creating the Enabling Act, which allowed him to do whatever he wanted. Second, he used propaganda and media to dehumanize Jewish people, and finally, he used a system of brutality to terrorize the people into submission. Approximately 100,000 Jews died during death marches. The first concentration camp was Dachau. The first arrivals to Dachau were political opponents of Hitler who were placed there in protective custody, including communists, socialists, and political Catholics. Later, it was used as an extermination camp for Jews. The soldiers who patrolled and operated concentration camps were known as Totenkopfverband, or Death's Head detachments. They wore skull and crossbones insignias on their uniforms to reflect their namesake. As Jews fled Europe under Hitler's rule, representatives from 32 countries met in Evian, France, in 1938 to discuss the growing refugee crisis in Europe. Representatives from Great Britain said it had no room to accommodate Jewish refugees. The Australians said, "We don't have a racial problem and we don't want to import one." Canada said of the Jews that none was too many. Holland and Denmark offered temporary asylum, but only for a few refugees. Only the Dominican Republic offered to take 100,000 Jews, but their relief agencies were so overwhelmed that only a few Jews could take advantage of the offer. A German foreign officer wrote a letter essentially saying that, in light of such responses, the world could not blame them, the Nazis, for not wanting the Jews. Soviet soldiers were the first to liberate the death camps. On July 23, 1944, they liberated Majdanek. Most of the world initially refused to believe the Soviet reports of the horrors they found there. Einsatzgruppen task forces were mobile killing vans, which were regular trucks with the exhaust pipes redirected into the cargo area. Jews were herded into these trucks, sometimes 90 at a time. The Einsatzgruppen killed over 1.2 million Jews.